Hi, everyone. On this episode of Journalists for Sale, we tackle West Africa and the recent coverage it has been drawing due to the military junta taking power in the country of Niger. Niger joins the so called coup belt in Africa, where countries like Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Mali have all experienced military coup takeovers in the last few years. We are joined by David Hundeyin, a Nigerian journalist and filmmaker whose name has been in the news lately for his reporting on the corrupt Nigerian politician and now president of the country, Bola Ahmed Tinubu. David helps us understand the anti imperialist sentiment spreading around the region, as well as the roles of countries like Russia and China in trying to present an alternative economy and security alliance as opposed to ECOWAS in the West. You can check out David's Substack and YouTube channel at westafricaweekly.substack.com and West Africa Weekly on YouTube. His handle on all platforms is at David Hundeyan. We'll be sure to leave it in the description. But yeah, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video to help us fight the algorithm and enjoy. Hi, David. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, we want to explore what's been happening recently in West Africa, and I think you'd be the perfect person to talk to specifically about this sort of, it's been called the coup corridor, um, involving countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, and now um, Niger. And so it seems like the common theme of around these coups is a sort of anti-imperialist sentiment that's been rising and with good reason. Um, so we want to, I just want to kind of want to get into the recent history and like what has happened in the region that has led to this moment. I understand that a country like Niger, I've read that 42% of the population lives below the poverty line. Even that 7% of the population lives in slave-like conditions. So I was just wondering if you can give us some background on that and what has led to this recent news.
Basically, Niger and the rest of the so-called coup belt are among the very poorest countries in the world. So I think of the 10 poorest countries in the world, I think four or five of them are in that coup belt. So there is Niger, there's Chad, there is Burkina Faso, there's Guinea, and um, Mali. Yeah, that's the fifth one. So these are countries which have nothing that resembles anything close to a modern economy. These are countries which um, have an economic model which is still stuck somewhere in 1850, where there's essentially a few or one primary exports, and that's pretty much the only significant industry taking place. Primary exports, which is basically raw materials, no value adding, nothing. So it's primary exports, it's petty trading, and it's government, and that's pretty much all there is to do in these countries, right? Um, Fortunately or unfortunately, life expectancy has been trending upward across much of these countries. So there's a growing population, and there's especially a growing population of young and restless people. Um, so the ingredients are in place for basically political instability. Now, what what makes the story here different from just any other poor, impoverished country with a large hungry population is that um, the primary exports that these countries primarily depend on. So in the case of Niger, it's uranium, it's gold, a few other primary exports like that. The country itself barely sees any benefit from these things. So Niger, for example, has the uranium exports that Niger registers. On paper, Niger exports uranium. In reality, a French or if a consortium of French companies in Niger exports uranium from Niger to France, and the Nigerian government gets paid a total tax royalty of about 6%. So the country sees barely any benefit. And bear in mind that uranium is um, essentially one of the most valuable raw materials that there is, and is directly responsible for powering at least 33% of the total electricity consumption of France. And yes, Niger itself, up to 70% of Niger's electricity consumption is directly supplied by Nigeria. Nigeria itself has woeful electricity production figures. In fact, when this recent crisis erupted and Nigeria cut its electricity supply to Niger, the government house in the capital was left without electricity. That's just to give you an understanding of just how dire the situation of such countries are. Now, um, rightly or wrongly, these coup leaders who have sort of started making their presence felt, going back to 2020 in Mali, I think going on into Burkina Faso and Chad, now Niger, and Guinea as well. What they have been able to do successfully is to sell the idea to the population that the reason that you, first of all, you do not deserve to be this poor. Country is not actually this poor, and that there is an external entity, i.e., France, which is directly benefiting from your poverty. I say rightly or wrongly because in some senses that may be true. In some other senses, not necessarily so. But be that as it may, they have successfully sold that idea, and that idea has taken root very powerfully. It's captured the public imagination very powerfully, and it is now widely believed in Niger, for example, that there is something wrong with the picture of a country where 33% of France's total electricity consumption is supplied essentially by Niger, but Niger cannot power itself. So clearly, in the eyes of the people, there's something wrong with that, and the answer to that question is France. France is the constant across all these questions. So you might have heard of the CFA franc, which is the currency that Nigeria uses. So the CFA, for the benefit of those watching who don't know what the CFA franc is, it's essentially a French-backed monetary union of 14 different African countries, essentially uh, storing all their foreign reserves with the Banque de France. So basically, these 14 countries do not issue their own currency. These 14 countries do not have the power to borrow unilaterally, for example, to issue debt. The normal tools of monetary and economic and fiscal policy that a sovereign independent country can be expected to have access to, these countries do not have access to. Everything has to go through the Banque de France in Paris. Everything has to be permissioned in Paris. So essentially, you have 14 African countries which are still very much economically and fiscally subservient to France. Part of the conditions for running this currency is that 50% of the total reserves held by these countries are held by the Banque de France. So essentially, you have France, which is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, a GDP of I think in excess of $5 trillion, basically being um, you could argue being held up or supported parasitically by the blood and sweat of 14 of the world's poorest countries on the world's poorest continent. So this idea that to start building a way out of that extreme grinding poverty and find a way into the 21st century, um, the sort of colonial weight of France has to be shaken off first. Is an idea that has taken root very powerfully, and the French, for whatever reason, have completely failed to understand to read the room. Basically, the the very fact that these coups have taken place one after the other in quick succession is not a coincidence. Historically, I think the last time there was a series of military coups across that region in Africa was sometime in the 80s, and there's always a clear pattern. So it's one, then it's another, and then before you know it, all the whole region has fallen. And clearly, there is that pattern of contagion which has started again. For whatever reason, France didn't seem to recognize what was happening, but the loss of Niger has sort of brought this into stark relief, and the French establishment has sort of stumbled into a blind panic because the realization now is that it's not just about losing Niger and losing Burkina Faso and Guinea as they did earlier, and Mali as well, but that across the rest of the so-called France Afrique, that idea that it's actually possible in the first place to get rid of France and the sky won't fall down, that idea is starting to take root politically, and it's a very politically powerful idea with the young populations of these countries. And where something is an idea with political currency, there will always be a politician who is going to arise to exploit it. So, um, again, I'm not. I'm not from a from a francophone African country. I'm from Nigeria, so it's not my place to say whether this is a good or a bad thing from the perspective of the francophones themselves. I think they are well qualified to speak for themselves. But what I will say is that it will certainly be very interesting to see, especially from the point of view of an African continent which is trying to open up to itself, which is trying to do things like eliminate trade barriers and movement restrictions within the continent. Because, as you may or may not know, Africa has by far the world's lowest rate of intra-regional trade. It's easier to trade between Bamako and Paris than to trade between Bamako and Lagos, which are about 2,000 kilometers away from each other. It makes no sense, but that's how the economic model of Africa has been structured. The African Union has been making attempts to change this situation. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the impending breakdown of France Afrique is going to play into that situation, and essentially how that will shape Africa as an economic force going into the 21st century. It's going to be very interesting to see. I personally would be very interested in seeing how it all plays out.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, and you mentioned how this pattern has emerged, but it seems like other countries in the region have not necessarily taken uh, s- uh, the way of the Western of French or anything, because I understand that Algeria, for example, has stated that they don't want to intervene militarily. I believe in the Senate in Nigeria, right, that they voted not to um, intervene. So it seems like you said, they were France was kind of caught off guard, but also these other countries are acknowledging like this is happening, but we don't want violence or we don't want to go in there ourselves.
Yes, because the memories of 2011 are still very fresh. The fall of Gaddafi, whom I personally thought was a brutal dictator, who ideally should have been removed by his own people, but the way it was executed by an external force and the chaotic manner in which this thing was done, and then the absolute mayhem that was left in the wake of this um, revolution, I think most um, most countries in the neighborhood now understand that violence is definitely not going to be the solution, because after Gaddafi was deposed, I mean, as far away as Nigeria, which is two borders away from Libya, we directly suffered it because Libya was one of the most heavily armed countries in the world, not just in Africa. It had, arms stockpiles for decades, right? And these arms fell into all sorts of hands after the chaotic breakdown of the Gaddafi regime, all sorts of non-state actors. And it's no coincidence that as soon as Libya fell into the chaos that it did, that's when Boko Haram in Nigeria, for example, became a thing, right? So we suffered a very direct penalty for the chaos that was instigated a couple of borders away. So it's very common knowledge now that under no circumstances do you want to import a war into your neighborhood, regardless of whatever moral justification you want to drum up for that war. A war is a war, and war is not a good thing, right? Especially not in an environment where the countries already have a pronounced lack of state capacity. These are already some of the poorest countries in the world. A developing country has no business engaging in anything destructive, right? A developing country's only job is to develop, is to grow, right? War is not something that some of the world's poorest countries, which have ambitions of someday being less poor, should be engaged in. And I think that that knowledge is has been sort of seared into our minds very painfully, because we've witnessed firsthand the mayhem that has been introduced into our region since 2011. prior to 2011, the idea of there being a terrorist attack in Nigeria was like it was a joke punchline. You know, we might have had our issues, but the idea of terrorism was something that we watched on TV. It was from something that related to exotic places like Afghanistan and Iraq. It had nothing to do with us. And then all of a sudden, in the space of a few months, we started having buildings being bombed, churches being attacked, suicide bombings, all sorts of things that we had never been acquainted with before, and not just in Nigeria, but across the entire sub-region. So now that these drums of war are being beaten again, you can see immediately everyone seems to be most players in the region are stepping back and saying, hey, under no circumstances is military intervention going to be on the table here. The one exception to this appears to be the Nigerian president, who for reasons which I suppose we'll get to later, um, is determined one way or another to prosecute some kind of military campaign in Niger, as ill-advised as that may be.
Yeah, and that leads me to ask you. So from 2002 to 2003, terror attacks in Sahel accounted for less than 1% of all terror attacks, and I guess last year there were 27,000 attacks. Even though the U.S. has been in the Sahel region using it as a kind of site to apparently fight these jihadists. So why has the Western response been such a failure? Do you think that it's been on purpose to kind of create a forever war, kind of like what Julian Assange says, to wash the hands out of the tax bases of the Western countries into the hands of a transnational elite, or is it more nuanced than that? And also, what do you make of this kind of response by what the governments of what the mainstream media is calling the coup belt to turn to Wagner to fight these jihadists instead? Because I know that some people are criticizing that move, but me, as someone that admittedly doesn't know much about this conflict, I kind of am wondering, like, well, if we're going to criticize them for turning to Wagner, how are they going to be able to fight these jihadists that the U.S. and the West event basically kind of inflicted this problem upon them through their actions in Libya, for example? So, what do you make of that?
So I try to, as much as possible, stay away from issuing verdicts as to what exactly the motivations for these actions were. I'm not in the minds of U.S. policymakers, so it could well be that some of these actions were sort of paternalistically well intentioned and they turned into a disaster. It could also be that they were very cynical, and the idea, as you said, is to create some kind of forever war for some sort of ulterior motive. I do not know. What I will say is that what is much more important than the motive is the outcome. So however well intentioned you might claim these interventions were, if they consistently lead to the same kind of outcome, which is a an extremely destructive and disruptive forever war that benefits absolutely nobody in the region, and which these major players suffer no real penalty for. The war is not taking place on their territory. It's not their troops dying. Um, and in terms of whatever financial support they provide, it's a in terms of the annual budget, it's like a rounding error. It's nothing to them. So if the U.S. is providing military aid worth $100 million to some African country to engage in some forever war, $100 million is absolutely nothing in terms of U.S. military budget. But so to and the war is not being fought on U.S. territory, so it's absolutely nothing to the U.S. Right? But on the ground, where the action is happening, it's everything. It creates a lot of damage, and so you cannot tell me that the country or the countries with the world's most extensive intelligence gathering capabilities, right? The countries which can essentially drop a coin anywhere on the planet and trace where you are. That these countries somehow do not know that their actions could lead to this, or that their actions in the past have led to this. I don't believe that. So, which is why in this particular instance, I and a few people like me have been very vocal about criticizing the 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 motives of the U.S. specifically. We know all about France, but we've been very vocal about criticizing the U.S., which is not something I generally tend to do. But in this case, it's like, okay, so what? How honestly do you think this is going to turn out? Right? You have Nigeria and Niger, which essentially are two countries which are almost indistinguishable from each other. Right? It's like the U.S. going to war with Canada. It's a stupid idea. Like, how do you even how does that even work functionally? Like, these two countries, like, is the border even functionally demarcated? And the people on both sides, do they recognize themselves as different people in the first place? Like, these are not natural boundaries. These are boundaries which were drawn in Berlin, right? It's just an imaginary line in the sand. The people on both sides of the imaginary border are the exact same. They speak the same language. They marry each other. We've lived together for centuries. How do you want to conduct a war under such circumstances without, creating some sort of, conditions that lead to ethnic genocide or something ridiculous like that? How do you propose to do that? And then you have Victoria Nuland from her high horse, someone who probably cannot locate Niger on the map, just issuing edicts, that we urge so and so to um, take all necessary steps to make sure constitutional order is restored, which is a very euphemistic way of saying march your military into this place and slap the shit out of them until they do what we say we want them to do. And it's like, okay, so in practice, how will that work? Nigeria is 1.25 times the geographical size of Nigeria, right? The Nigerian military has not been able to successfully secure Nigeria's territory, right? There are all sorts of terrorists and non-state actors who control all sorts of real estate within Nigeria. So you want to now take out that overstretched military. You want to take them to another country which is even bigger than Nigeria and somehow secure it, and then in the process, this country, Niger, which is like the final buffer between Nigeria and the chaos zone that is Libya, you want to take out the semblance of state capacity and stability that prevents that chaos from directly afflicting 200 million people in Nigeria. And somehow the Nigerian military, which has at best maybe 250,000 fighting men, should somehow do all of this. How? It's not materially feasible. It's not possible. And of course, the US is not going to put boots on the ground to protect the interests of Niger or Nigeria. We're not important enough as far as US foreign policy doctrine is concerned. So essentially, we're going to be left to our devices. It's going to turn into it's going to turn into Somalia basically, and they're going to do what they always do, which is wash their hands of the situation and leave us to our own devices. So under no circumstances, should such a conflict break out in the first place, which is what some of us have been very strident about putting across. Now, to your second question, which was about the alleged presence of the Wagner mercenary group, it's no surprise that some of these countries, Nigeria specifically, have turned to Russia. It's important to remember that during the African independence era or the immediate post-independence era, the then USSR was one of Africa's most important allies at the time because for whatever reason, the anti-colonial struggle became very closely aligned with um, socialism, Marxism, and communism at the time. I personally think that may have been a mistake, at least in economic terms, but that was certainly very much the reality at the time. That the big capitalist powers, for reasons best known to them, chose to stay on the wrong side of history for reasons best known to them. So the US, the UK, France, they were very very much on the side of colonialism, apartheid, settler community, all those kinds of things. So um, for the longest time, there has been, I believe, a very damaging misconception on the African continent that um, basically maintaining independence and sovereignty somehow equates to having an outlook that is analogous to Marxism, socialism, communism. And I believe that this, at least in purely economic terms, I think the economic argument about which works between capitalism and Marxism, I think that argument was settled maybe 40 years ago. I don't believe that's a genuine argument. today. Um, However, because of the undeniable um, fruits of the partnership between the USSR and Africa at the time, a lot of the leadership class in these countries, Nigeria included, have this very strongly favorable view of Russia, which I suppose many in the West will struggle to understand because, as far as people in the West will see it, Russia is essentially is a rogue nation led by a dictator, blah 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 blah. So why on earth would you want to move away from France and the US into the arms of Vladimir Putin? That's the way to be seen in the West. However, there's context, right? The relationship between Africa and Russia goes, long predates Vladimir Putin. So that's one thing. The second thing is, as you rightly mentioned, in the vacuum that will be created by the exit of U.S. and French military presence, the only realistic alternative that can plug well, that will seem to be able to plug that hole and provide some sort of logistical support in the fight against the jihadists who are threatening the entire sub-region is Russia, like it or not. I personally have my reservations because I certainly don't believe that the Russians are acting in anything other than their own self-interest. I don't believe there is really any functional difference between the Americans or the Russians. I think they're two sides of the same coin. I I think it's also very instructive that, even though technically speaking, the US and Russia, um, I think at their northernmost extremities, there is about 3 miles of distance between them. They're technically neighbors, and yet there has never been a direct conflict between them on their own land. They rather prefer to have their everlasting conflict on other people's lands. So I think this is shaping up to be just another proxy war between the US and Russia. So I certainly don't think the US is the bad guy, Russia is the good guy. It's, those simplistic narratives are never useful. There is no such thing as a good guy or a bad guy. Everyone is acting in their own selfish interest. Um, but I think, certainly from the point of view of a Nigerian coup leader or a Burkinabe coup leader, they will certainly see it like, look, we've partnered with the US and France for all these years, and the jihadi problem, which these people basically created for us, whether deliberately or inadvertently, has only got worse. So, why don't we might as well try something new. That probably will be the way they will rationalize it or justify it. I'm not saying that is right or wrong, but that's certainly how they will see it. And I think in that sense, the US and France have sort of created a rod for their own back, um, because it's been clear that in as much as they have, offered some logistical support in the fight against the jihadis, it's been very much, I'm very glad that you used to use the term forever war because I think that characterizes a lot of the relationship, the military relationship between the US and these parts of Africa. It's sort of like we will give you we will give you just enough support to give you hope, but we will never actually sort of provide the overwhelming force that is needed to actually crush this thing once and for all, right? So we'll build $100 million drone base in Agadez, right? Agadez is in central Niger. So bear in mind, Niger is a country whose total GDP is about what, $25 billion annually, and then you're building a drone base worth about 0.4% of the country's entire GDP, right? An air force base, and that's it. But there's so you're putting down that kind of investment, which kind of gives them hope that, okay, the US is going to support us in this war against these terrorists who are making our lives miserable. But then it's nothing significant beyond that. You're not putting boots on the ground. You're certainly not risking American lives to fight Boko Haram or to fight ISWAP or the other dozens of splinter groups and non-state actors which are springing out of Libya. You're certainly not doing that, and you're certainly not providing the kind of military equipment to the Nigerian military that is needed for them to actually achieve their objectives. If they ask for this equipment, you bring up stuff like the Leahy law. You will accuse them of human rights violations, which are true, by the way, But it's very interesting that those human rights concerns never apply where countries like Saudi Arabia are involved. It's when you're dealing with Niger, which doesn't have the world's largest deposits of oil and a $1 trillion sovereign fund under its no, under its management, that you can start negotiating and talking about how you can't give them this equipment because they shot at protesters. Meanwhile, the Saudi regime regularly executes protesters, but that's fine. That's not a problem. You give them F-16s. you know so from the point of view of these countries, I guess I can see how the sort of open hypocrisy of Western players has sort of made them feel like, you know what, we might as well try this big bad Putin guy. Let's see what he has to offer. I personally don't think that, in general, this is going to end well for anyone. But as I said, from the point of view of creating a new economic paradigm outside of French control. That's personally what I am looking forward to seeing. But from a military perspective, I don't necessarily see any progress being made in the fight against jihadists. Whether partnering with the US or partnering with Russia, I think they're both sides of the same coin. I think Russia will do exactly what the US is doing.
Could you expand on that? Because I'm just reading about how they hold the Russia Africa summit. They invite all these leaders who were all willing to go, and I know that Russia erased like $20 billion worth of their debt and all these things. So I was just wondering how exactly it would be, unless this is just like a cover for later things that they want to do. And could you also bring in China into this? Because I know that they're also heavily involved in the region and getting more involved. And it seems like it's becoming this whole uh, multipolar world affair where it's the West versus the Western bloc versus the Eastern bloc, and all these proxies all over the place.
So, to sort of illustrate the partnership between Russia and Africa, I'll mention something you may not be aware of. So, as of 1979, the world's largest steel mill, right, the world's largest steel foundry, basically, was built in Nigeria, of all places, and it was built by the Soviets. It's called the Ajaokuta Steel Mill. Now, unfortunately, being that Nigeria is Nigeria and it's not for in the interest of politeness, let's just say it's not the most competent government in the world. This steel mill, as massive as it was the largest in the world at the time. Um, I think 40 plus years since then, has never actually produced anything, right? So, but just for the fact that the Russians were willing and able to put that kind of investment into some sub-Saharan African country, that's something that the US would never do. Why on earth would the American states use billions of dollars to build some huge infrastructure project in sub-Saharan Africa? That's just not something that you see. But that's something that the USSR did regularly. Obviously, being that it had there were this was entirely politically motivated. These projects were often very poorly executed or poorly conceived, and as a result, didn't do much. So, in the case of this steel mill, for example, it's never produced anything. There were several projects like that, but again, these things were done for political purposes. They were done to buy loyalties within Africa, and they were very successful. So even though the USSR no longer exists, Russia just by virtue of the history between USSR and Africa continues to command a huge amount of respect and um, diplomatic sway within Africa. So you might recall sometime last month, in South Africa, the emerging opposition party, the EFF, that's the Economic Freedom Fighters, led by Julius Malema, when they were having their 10th anniversary celebration, where they filled up the country's biggest stadium in a sea of red. Julius Malema delivered a speech and he said, "We are Putin and Putin is us," and he meant that. He genuinely meant that. So that is the relationship that Russia has been able to curate with within a lot of African leadership spaces. I personally am not. Um, I don't believe that if one is looking to build a 21st century economy, that Russia is necessarily the partner to be building it with. But that's just my opinion anyway. Um, Certainly those who are paid to have opinions within African diplomatic spaces, they hold the opinions that they hold. Um, so there isn't actually that much at present. There isn't actually that much economic interdependence between Russia and Africa. Yes, $20 billion worth of loans were forgiven. Yes, but $20 billion in terms of the actual sovereign load debt on the African continent is a drop in the bucket. It's not much. Um, it's more of a symbolic gesture than anything else. It's Putin basically um, saying that, look, this whole BRICS thing, this whole multipolar thing we're trying to build, trying to take the world out of the sort of the sole ambit of the US. Africa is going to have a place in that, and here's how I show you that. So it was if you, that US Africa summit, I actually found it very interesting because in addition to forgiving debts worth $20 billion, um, he actually gave out gifts to individual African heads of states, which I found very instructive. So the president of Zimbabwe got a new helicopter, for example, and to you that might not sound like that might sound a bit absurd, but I can tell you that certainly within the local Zimbabwean press, that played very well for some reason. You know, it played very well that look when African leaders go to US Africa summits or go to EU Africa summits, they're actually treated with disrespect. But when they go to the Russia Africa summit, they're not only treated as though they have a seat at the table with everyone else, but they actually even given gifts. It's a political gambit, and Vladimir Putin is very good, I think, at reading political tea leaves in the third world and knowing how to play the popular imagination. He's very good at that. China, on the other hand, China is a much more serious operator within the African continent. Their engagement is not so much militaristic as the Russians is. However, there's hardly any significant African economy you can point to now that isn't in some way systemically beholden to the Chinese. Um, pretty much the entire telecoms infrastructure within Africa, for example, was built by companies like Huawei, and a lot of this wasn't funded by African governments. A lot of this was Chinese government funded. So that you could view it as strategically buying influence, but it's also more than just a political gambit. They're also it's an investment basically because they clearly see Africa as a continent that will be important for their power projection in the future. So they've built roads, they've built railways, they've built stadiums, universities, hospitals, like infrastructure that the West traditionally has been very unwilling to fund on the African continent. Hydroelectric dams, power stations, those sorts of things. The Chinese have been they the investment has slowed down of recent because the Chinese economy obviously has taken a hit after COVID, and um, it's no longer politically popular within China to throw vast sums of money at Africa the way it once was. But be that as it may, in Nigeria where I come from, for example, there's pretty much all of the new standard gauge rail infrastructure that has been built in the country since 2011 has been Chinese built. Pretty much all of it, not just Chinese built, but Chinese funded. Pretty much all of it. Ditto Kenya. Ghana also has a line on that is currently under construction. It's Chinese funded, Chinese built as well. Um, there's hardly anywhere you look at except maybe South Africa, which already, as had a relatively high standard of infrastructure already. So you really didn't need as much investment as the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. So the Chinese have positioned themselves, I think, very brilliantly. Um, regard regardless of what does or does not happen between the US and Russia, the Chinese are going to be, in my opinion, are going to be the single largest, certainly the single largest trading partner that Africa is going to have in 21st century, for better or for worse. That is definitely going to happen. So, um, I I think it's still a bit early to claim that the world has become multipolar. The U.S. has, the American empire is, I've read a lot of these opinions. The U.S. is a failing empire. The U.S. dollar is being phased out. The proposed BRICS currency, BRICS bank, and I still think a lot of this is premature. It's still early. The US is still very much the 800-pound gorilla in the room, whether we like it or not. It is, and it's going to be for some time. You know, um, we often say Rome wasn't built in a day. Well, Rome also didn't decline in a day. Right, the decline was very, very steady, very gradual. It took centuries, maybe. So the US is always going to be there in some form. However, it's also becoming increasingly clear that the Chinese and the Russians also have their own long-term plans for not necessarily world domination, but um, creating their own little fiefdoms, creating their own little spheres of influence. And clearly, they see Africa as central to these plans, for better or for worse. Um, this may or may not be a good thing, objectively speaking, but certainly from the point of view of African leaders who have gotten tired of constantly begging for support from the West that isn't forthcoming, or constantly dealing with Western duplicity and hypocrisy, or dealing with the results of Western interventions, such as in Libya. Any alternative looks like something. So I think that's what we're seeing now.
Um, so it seems you're kind of skeptical of this sentiment that's been being uh, attributed to Russia and China, or at least of Russia. It seems like of mutually beneficial cooperation, that they've kind of pitched this. That this is the reason that they're supporting Africa, right? We're going to mutually benefit each other, and we're both going to get things out of this. Neither of us are exploiting one another. We're not like the U.S. We're different. Um, but what you just told me about this history of told us about this history of like the USSR infrastructure projects kind of amounting to nothing a lot of the times, and that a lot of these economic gestures are just simply gestures, symbolic gestures to kind of signal to Africa that in this new emerging world they want them to have a role in it. Whatever that role is, we don't know how to what extent it'll uplift the working people of Africa and the impoverished people of Africa, but you will have a place. Um, so is this mutually beneficial cooperation a myth, or is it too early to tell? Because like the people that I see saying that it's real often just point out these things that look at what Russia's doing there and China's doing. They're building infrastructure. They're giving financial economic aid. They're not going in with their military and causing death and destruction. So therefore, it's good. But based on the way that I've at least learn to perceive how power works, I don't see it almost ever being used benevolently completely. It's almost always acting in its own self-interest. So, yeah, how do you perceive it? Is the mutually beneficial cooperation a myth? Is it too early to objectively tell? Are people all just acting on hunches at this point in terms of like what will pan out? So, what do you think about that?
I think people are projecting what they would like to see onto what is actually there. I think, as I said earlier, it's simply too early to tell in a lot of cases what exactly the motivations or the long term strategy is. I think people are just tired of the status quo, and they're willing to jump at anything as as the savior. Which is not to say that the Russians and the Chinese do not have are not extremely useful in the current African context. They certainly are. I personally have been very vocal about um, basically not looking a gift horse in the mouth, right? So if the Chinese are willing to build an economically beneficial rail line or power station or port, and whatever ulterior motives that they may have, if this is going to be in your interest to get it done, you don't look a gift horse in the mouth. You take it, because who else is offering you that deal, right? However, I think, especially from the point of view of a sort of ideological, the emerging youth ideology on the African continent is, to my eyes, is closely resembling a lot of what was the youth ideology during my dad's youth in the 50s and 60s. And the problem I have with that is it's this very sort of starry-eyed, sort of doe-eyed, rose-tinted idea of um, what impression that the challengers of the status quo seek to actually have on the world. Like, yes, we know all about US and Western hypocrisy, duplicity, violence. We know all about these things. The new people who are coming in as challengers obviously have no choice than to position themselves as different. They have no choice than to do that. They're not doing that because they're virtuous or they're benevolent. It's simply because that's the only strategy that will work. If so, France, for example, is essentially living parasitically off the back of 14 African countries, and then you are Russia and you want to muscle in on the act. You cannot then come in and basically try to replicate what France is doing. No one is going to give you the time of day. There's already one slave master there. Why would anyone want to exchange one slave master for another, right? So of course the strategy would be to present a carrot, right? There's always a carrot. Eventually the stick will show itself, inevitably, because as you said, that's just how power works, right? If Africans were the ones in power, it will be the same thing. That's just how power works. That's just how human beings are, right? Regardless. And I think history bears me out on this. So I think for now, it's their presence and their partnership is certainly very useful. It's a useful bargaining chip that we certainly didn't have before. But I think in terms of seeing them as sort of a new strategic ally or anything like that, I think Africa in general should be very cautious about going into these sort of long-term strategic partnerships with anybody, right? Because I think history bears me out on the idea that pretty much everyone, Western, Eastern, or otherwise, who has come into Africa within the past 600 years has come in with only one objective in mind, by and large. So regardless of what form that this objective initially takes, it's the same objective. So um, they are certainly useful, but I don't believe that by virtue of being useful at the time or being different, apparently now that makes them better. I don't believe that. I just believe that they are useful, and basically you should trust them only as far as you can throw them. You should use them for all that they have, for all that they can offer. But you should always remember that at the end of the day, um, if you want to be independent and sovereign, then you have to always make sure that you are taking decisions based on your personal interest every single time, because that's exactly what the US, the Russians, and the Chinese do every single time. They don't make decisions based on who is the ally or who built a stadium for them in 1956. Who built their first hospital, or those are very nice gestures, but self-interest is self-interest.
Right, 100%. And just to wrap it up, we want to get into, you wrote an extensive article about Nigeria's current president, Bola Ahmed Tinubu. So the U.S. and France have claimed that they're against coup governments because they want to support democracy. But I think you can, if you wanted to write a textbook on how to be corrupt, I think Tinubu would be a great example. Can you explain how he won this election and tie it into Western support? I mean, if people want to get the full backstory of him, they should definitely read your article on your Substack, and also you said you have a documentary on him as well. But yeah, can you go into that whole election, who he is, and his connection to the West via ECOWAS and so forth?
So, short answer, how did he win the election? He didn't. That's the short answer. But Nigeria being Nigeria, um, who wins the election and who gets declared as the winner of the election are not always the same thing. because that's the reality of a lot of countries in the global south. The institutions, the supposed democratic institutions, are simply not strong enough to function independently. So the ruling party essentially gets to determine how everything takes place, right, including the conduct of elections. So, I mean, it's not a secret in Nigeria or on the African continent that the Nigerian people did not vote for this guy, even according to the official figures. The official figures, that's what I'm referencing this time. The official figures state that he supposedly got, well, 8 point something million votes, and then the two challengers, the two opposition candidates, each got 6 point something million votes, meaning the opposition in total polled about 12 million votes, and he did about 8 million. So, objectively speaking, this person cannot be said to have won the election, right? Because more people voted against him than those who voted for him, significantly more. You know, his own home state, he lost it, even according to the official figures. His own home state. It would be like George Bush losing in Texas. That happened. You know, so
How
but
does the media then spin it that he won if the official figures are just how do they, like, how do they announce that he's the winner?
so we were asleep at literally 4 a.m. I think this was February. What was this? February 28th. I think it was 4 a.m. The Independent National Electoral Commission made an announcement at 4 a.m. in the morning. They just announced him as a winner. The vote counting officially hadn't even got halfway. Officially, according to their own figures, the vote counting had barely reached halfway. There was no data to support the idea that this person won the election, but they just announced him. And it's like, okay, this person is now the president elect. And that's the problem with a lot of these institutions, right? That's the problem with the very institution of constitutional democracy makes it such that at every step, there are several ways to game the system. So, if, for example, it states in the Constitution that anyone who is declared as the president elect of a country um, essentially will become the president unless there is a successful legal challenge. That essentially means that if you want to become the president, your job is not to win the election. Your job is to be declared by the INEC as the winner of the election. And there are there are backdoor ways of accomplishing that. And once you do that, it then becomes the job of whoever actually won the election to then go to court and prove it. A court that you, by extension, now get to control. So that's the sort of clown shoes situation we have now, where he has been sworn in as president. He has been president for about 4 months now, but there's a presidential petition going on in court. And the two major opposition candidates have put forth very strong arguments showing that not only did he not win the election, he was actually not legally qualified to be on the ballot. He should not have been permitted to be on the ballot, right? That technically, under Nigerian law, he's classed as an ex-convict. Ex-convicts are not allowed to run for president. And that secondly, the information he supplied as part of his declaration was perjurious. The documents he submitted were forgeries, right? And the disclosures that he made were not complete. So, for example, the Constitution states that you're only allowed to run for president if you have sole citizenship of Nigeria. So, essentially, if you're a dual citizen, you're not permitted to run except under special circumstances. Now, on the INEC form, it states, "Have you ever obtained any other citizenship?" You take no. But I was actually partly responsible for actually unearthing evidence showing that he, in fact, has at least one other citizenship which has not been declared. That was also presented in court. So, amidst all of this, he's the president anyway, and the judiciary, which is supposed to be an independent institution under constitutional democracy, functionally is not independent because the president gets to nominate judges. The payments, the salaries of the judiciary are controlled by the executive. So there are so many ways of ensuring that you know democracy, as we know it, can be kneecapped. So a couple of months ago, I was speaking at a press conference in London, and I actually addressed this very issue that um, the, and I use the term a performance democracy to describe Nigeria and a lot of African states. That a lot of African leaders have figured out that what American and Western public officials mean when they say that they want to support democracy in Africa. It's not that they actually want to support the will of the people in Africa. It's that they want to support the form of constitutional democracy in Africa. The form, right? So, regardless of whatever chicanery goes on in the background, as long as you have a piece of paper stating that you were declared the winner of this election, as long as you have the documents, basically the receipts, that's it. No one is interested in anything else. So the EU observer mission to the election put out a very damning report. The EU observer mission basically stated that there is no evidence to support the idea that Tinubu won the election. That's the EU, which is, I mean, it's an independent institution, right? The EU's observer mission. And then, 2 days after that report was released, you then had, what's his name, the U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, putting forward a call to the supposed president, congratulating him. Because as far as they're concerned, look, that's not really our problem. Our business is we have foreign policy interests, we have foreign policy goals. This is someone who's going to be a useful partner to us in the region, because obviously, we have we have his FBI file somewhere. So if he ever wants to get out of line, we can remind him that, hey, you know, our hand is up your ass. So that's really important. So the very concept of democracy is, I think, has been conflated with, um there's a term I'm looking for, where the the actual substance has been substituted for form. So someone like Paul Biya, who has been president of Cameroon since 1982, under Western standards, is classified as a democratically elected leader. I mean, he's a dictator. He rigs elections. He has changed the constitution multiple times to give himself, to make himself life president, basically. But as long as he has the paper stating that he won the election or something resembling an election, everyone is fine with it. As long as he's not wearing military fatigues, right? Everyone is fine with it. He's a civilian. That means that he's democratically elected, which is not true, because civilian dictators, in my opinion, are actually worse than military dictators. Or the guy in Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, who has been in power since 4 years before I was born. I'm 33 now, right? And he wins elections every 5 years, so he's democratically elected. Or the guy in Togo, who basically inherited the country from his dad. His dad was a life president. His dad died. He took over the presidency, and he's been president since 2006, and he's still there, and he's probably going to die in office too. But because he's not wearing military fatigues, you will say, well, he's democratically elected. He's a civilian, civilian leader. Which in my opinion is, utter flaming bullshit. So, I mean, going forward, I think, uh, if we are trying to ensure that this contagion of coups doesn't become more rampant across the West African or Central African sub-region, some of these um, powerful countries need to become more honest about what exactly the metrics they use in ascribing democracy to certain people are or are not, right? Because where you have, in the case of Nigeria, you have a democratically elected president who nobody voted for. And then you have the US, you have Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Anthony Blinken, everyone like blowing up his phone every 5 minutes, urging him to go to war in Niger, and get thousands of Africans killed in pursuit of US foreign policy objectives, in a way that is not going to impact on the US in any significant way, right? How is that democratic exactly? So I think these are questions that need to be answered, and I think that's why the entry of the Russians, especially, into the mix, is very interesting and very useful because I think it will force the American political establishment to uh, um, to face some of these questions that it has refused to answer for decades.
Yeah, hopefully they do face them. It seems like they usually do everything they can to not have to face any of these questions that should be answered. But thank you so much, David, for this conversation. It was extremely enlightening and educational. I learned a lot. If you wanted to let people know where they can find your work and maybe tease anything that you're working on, go ahead.
Right. So my platform, it's a Substack newsletter. It's called West Africa Weekly. So that's westafricaweekly.substack.com. And then my documentary channel on YouTube is also called West Africa Weekly on YouTube. And then you can find me on social media. My name is at David Hundeyin across all social media.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you,
Thank you for
David.
having me.